Hey, so listen, this was low key recorded on June 24th, 2023, but I'm posting it now on the day before my birthday because, of course. Anyways, hope you like it. Hey, everybody, welcome back to the DangerNaak podcast. I'm your host, AcroNM. Almost forgot the name of the show that I created. Hey everybody, welcome back to the DangerNaak podcast. I'm your host, AcroNM, and I know what you're gonna say, video podcast, ooh, ah. Well, it's been a long time coming, and I'm way too late on the train. But enough of the formalities, we got a lot to talk about today. So today's video, I'm gonna primarily focus on one thing, if my attention span allows me to. But we're gonna be reviewing Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse today. It's been like about a couple weeks since it came out, and I've been meaning to get to this earlier. Oh God, I'm doing it again. Explanation. Forget that. No prefacing. No, none of that. We're just gonna get right into it. Okay. First of all, movie phenomenal. God, this movie banged. This movie banged. All right. That's it. That's the end of the review. No, I'm playing. Anyways, man, I don't know how many of you guys who are watching this video right now have either A, seen Across the Spider-Verse, or B, seen Into the Spider-Verse. And if you haven't, major spoilers ahead. Like, this is all spoilers. All right. And as much as I'd like you to watch this video, which I really do, so if you haven't, go watch those movies when you can. And then if you have the wherewithal to remember, come back and watch this. And this is my review of Across the Spider-Verse with a little sprinkling of Into the Spider-Verse in there as a kind of litmus test of how this movie performed in my eyes. Yeah, so let's get started. All right. So to start off, I was very hesitant, or not hesitant, but Into the Spider-Verse set the bar really high. So I'm like, what could they do with this that really propelled it Across the Spider-Verse so much forward? And honestly, it's the fact that they wasted no time to show Miles understanding what Spider-Man entails and how to be Spider-Man. So he's already fully fledged Spider-Man by the time Across the Spider-Verse starts. So that way, we skip the learning phase and we get to more of the ramifications of being Spider-Man. But before I even start all that, I think it's worth shouting out the players at play who were the catalyst for Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse to happen and Into the Spider-Verse. But the main one, for those who may not know, is that Miles as a character primarily exists because of Donald Glover, aka Childish Gambino. And there's a whole story, the article I'll link below instead of trying to explain it off the top of my memory. But essentially, he was the one who proposed the idea of a black Spider-Man, but not necessarily Peter Parker. It's an original character under the helm or mantle of Spider-Man. I'm not sure if he had direct talks when they were creating Spider-Man Miles Morales, but if it wasn't for ultimately Donald Glover, then we wouldn't have Miles Morales today. So we owe him a lot of credit, and I want to give Sony credit too, but So I have a love-hate relationship with Sony. So for those who may not know, as I've kind of talked about on an much older podcast, is that Sony owns the right to all Spider-Man intellectual property. And my fridge turned on, and it's going to be annoying in the background, so forgive me. But since Sony owns Spider-Man, they kind of... At first, I kind of thought of it as they're holding Spider-Man hostage from being sucked into the Disney kind of behemoth monopoly, and which made me scared because I was like, oh, okay, well, they're not gonna have the Tom Holland Spider-Man in the MCU anymore. They're gonna have him be on the side, and it's not gonna feel like a whole cohesive Marvel universe if Spider-Man is not a part of that. So that was kind of my trepidations at the beginning. But in my opinion, I feel like movies like Into the Spider-Verse, Across the Spider-Verse, and even the Spider-Man games on PlayStation would not be what they are if they were under the Disney kind of umbrella. It allows for kind of that more freedom, and we all know how like outside of that how it can go, but with like the Marvel's Avengers games and how much that sucked, like what if Spider-Man PS4 and PS5 sucked that bad? We'd be living in an alternate universe. But yeah, ultimately I want to like I do give Sony their props for that, for what they do with Spider-Man directly Spider-Man. But Spider-Man adjacent stuff is where I'm like, what the hell are you doing? Like their kind of obsession, I guess that since that's their only IPs now, is like Spider-Man villains. So Venom 1, I loved it. It was great. Was it peak cinema? Not necessarily, but we got to see Venom like in a huge form and kind of really push him back into the mainstream, I guess, ever since the Spider-Man 3 with Tobey Maguire. Like, this was much better Venom from that. But with everything else they're doing, like with whatever the hell Morbius was, listen, did not make more $1 billion. Now they're making Kraven the Hunter, which that trailer just came out. I don't know what to even say about that. It's like, it might as well not be what it is, like called, but it just so happens to be Spider-Man adjacent. And then they throw like little hints with like spiders coming down on top of Kraven and like, oh, Spider-Man exists somewhere, not here necessarily exactly, but somewhere. And it's just all like, no one really cares. That's why it's going to flop. And that's why I'm also going to be there on opening night, seated. I'm a part of the problem. All right. I understand. But yeah, so that's where I'm at with Sony. I'm happy that they're doing what they're doing with Miles Morales, Across the Spider-Verse kind of series with the games, but they just need to relax with everything else. And then they were gonna make this movie called El Muerto, which is like, I don't even know what it's about necessarily, just like a wrestling villain for Spider-Man who only appeared in 2 comic books, not even like series, 2 physical books. Sorry, hurt Miles' head. I'll talk about this little contraption I made with the Miles mask later. But yeah, like they were gonna have Bad Bunny play El Muerto, who like is a no-name character even within the comic book community. I don't even know, like they're like digging for scraps now for like Spider-Man somewhat related characters. And I just want them to figure that out because it's not looking good in there other than Spider-Man stuff. But yeah, so listen, I'm taking this episode seriously. I have a whole my iPad out with a bunch of notes, talking points, so I don't miss anything, because this movie and everything surrounding this movie has so much to kind of discuss and kind of dive deep into, and it's so much to the point that I can't get into all of it. Like, I'm 100% gonna skip something I wanted to talk about. I'm gonna post this and be like, damn, should have talked about that. But then otherwise this podcast would be like 4 hours long, which, talking to myself, I can do, but it will be difficult. But yeah, so let's see, checking off some lists. So I guess I get started with the actual review of the movie. Oh, actually, you know what? Even before I start talking about the movie, I do want to talk about kind of like almost all of this review is going to be positive. But in terms of to get the negatives out the way, it doesn't even have to necessarily do with the movie itself, but with like the production of the movie. And I would feel disingenuous to not mention that when talking about the Spider-Verse movies, because these movies are, in terms of animation, like unreal. of how they were able to create what they created in both the previous Into the Spider-Verse movies and the Across the Spider-Verse movies. Like, just a true pioneer in animation production and movie making. Like, nothing I've ever seen before, at least. And probably many other people have not seen before as well. But with that comes the people who actually produce it. And in talks about that just recently came out, which I'm kind of glad now that I'm recording this a little bit later, because this news kind of became more prevalent within the past few days, of like the production of Across the Spider-Verse, where the animators were like pushed to their like limits essentially. And if I remember correctly, and I'll also leave an article for this below, that like approximately like 100 animators just left the project because of like the strict kind of requests and workload that the producers were putting on their animators. And I believe the names were like Amy Pascal and Ari Avid, if I'm going to put their names here, and do want to give them like props for like creating such an amazing movie. But under the circumstances with which you hear these people working under, it makes you like feel like it could be done a different way with a more concise execution, so that we get the production, the frontier kind of animation without kind of the violations of people's kind of labor. They were like saying things like they were working like 7 days a week for like 14 hours or something like that. And having to, at the end of the, like when scenes were already done, scrapping them and like redoing them and repeating that cycle for already finished product, not like in the early production stages or whatever. So it just shows that they didn't have a hardline plan from the beginning and what they were going to do, and they kind of threw things at the wall and then scrapped and then rebuilt and scrapped and rebuilt, which takes a lot of effort on their end, and especially when you're running up close to a deadline. Which is why when I was watching Spider-Man and I came out of it, they were saying that Across the Spider-Verse, I should say, that the third installment in the trilogy is going to come out in like March of next year, 2024. I was like, damn, they must have like it all mostly done and they're going to like clean it up. But apparently that's not the case. And apparently like people like Haley Steinfeld, who's the voice of Gwen, hasn't even recorded her lines yet. There's a lot of animation that is just like in skeletal phases and has not been fully produced. So they're like, with all this news out, I wonder if they're gonna dial back their like pressure that they're putting on their animators. But in my eyes, there's no way it's gonna make that deadline of March 2024 for the third installment of the trilogy. Like, that's, unless they're literally killing these people working. So although I want it really badly and so fast, hey, hold on. Although I want Beyond the Spider-Verse to arrive quickly, I do not want it to be at the sake of like the people producing it, because let's say they do that at the sake of their like mental health and their physical capabilities as animators and producers, then movies like this will be less likely to occur, or the quality will go down, which is kind of what we saw in like recent MCU movies, where like the VFX artists were like pushed to their limits and had to like rewrite or like redevelop visual effects on like deadline, like super strict deadlines, like running up against the premieres and things like that, where it comes out and you're like, what the hell is this? Like in Thor Love and Thunder, like the shoddy CGI and stuff like that. It doesn't seem like there was as much heart and love put into it, especially when you're looking at movies from the 2012 era, and like even like the first Transformers movie, where the animation is literally ahead of its time. Like, we should be progressing, not regressing in terms of our like digital and visual capabilities. But the reason that is because these animators and visual effects artists are literally pushed to their limits on such unreasonable deadlines and having to rewrite or redevelop. So that's just my spiel. I wasted a lot of time on that, but it's worth saying. But I hope this other movie comes out quickly, or Beyond the Spider-Verse comes out quickly, but not at the expense of the people creating it. So hopefully Sony and the Spider-Verse producers take heed to what people are saying and adjust accordingly. But yeah. But let's move on. And oh my God, I wanted to mention, there's like multiple versions of this movie out right now. Like if you go to a theater and you watch it one day and you go again and you watch another day, there will be some like small minor scenes or clips that exist in one version or one theater that don't exist in another. And I think since I've already saw it twice in theaters, I think I've noticed one of them that people have said where Miguel is talking to his like AI assistant, his like Siri kind of character. I forgot the name of the character. But at the very end of the sentence, she like does like a selfie with him and he has like bunny ears, like a Snapchat filter, and then one that he doesn't. And I think I did kind of subconsciously notice that. And it was more apparent once someone said something about it. And there's been other clips as well where they've been slightly changed. So who knows like how much extra has not been included in this movie. But that's another testament to how much work that the animators have done and how much did not even make the slate. But thought that was interesting. But yeah, let's see, moving forward. I want to get into like the overarching stuff first before getting into the like nitty gritty of the plot, the characters and stuff. But one of the biggest things from Into the Spider-Verse that people were really excited about and across was the soundtrack, or not necessarily the soundtrack, but also like the corresponding album to the movie. I need some sippy sips. So the Into the Spider-Verse album was iconic, honestly, especially like within not even the comic book community. Like that's one thing that these movies I feel like are really great at, is that they bring in people outside of just specific like comic book nerds or whatever. And honestly, that when I see people who are not necessarily into comics per se, and they may have just like a working knowledge of like major characters, it just makes me feel good inside that they're consuming a piece of content that I'm very passionate about, and they appreciate it. And it's like kind of bringing someone into your home and like showing them like your collections or your like interests and hobbies without like, obviously like I have no kind of connections or ties to the movie itself, but I do feel a connection to the comic book culture and history. And it just feels cool that like when people who are new to it or are just like casual enjoyers of the content like really appreciate it. I think that's what both Into the Spider-Verse and Across the Spider-Verse were able to achieve. And it's very popular in like pop culture now. Like you see all these memes, you see things that kind of extend beyond like people making references to the movie and they haven't even seen the movie yet. Like I've heard a couple people making jokes related to the movie who haven't even seen it yet. So I think that's important to say, especially because a lot of people feel like there's a lot of quote unquote superhero fatigue in terms of like there's too many superhero movies and people feel like it doesn't feel as much of a spectacle, or like it's just kind of inflated and like diluted in terms of impact. But movies like Guardians of the Galaxy and Into the Spider-Verse can really show that it's less about them being too many superhero movies. It's more about them being too many bad superhero movies, which I'll get into in another video talking about the immediate kind of recent movies of Marvel and DC and kind of where their futures are at. But that's a whole nother discussion. Or I was saying something. Oh yeah, the soundtracks. Soundtrack of the first album of Into the Spider-Verse, phenomenal. I think like the top 3 tracks, like I'm Not Afraid of the Dark, I think is one of them. I think that's the title of it. I love that song. What's Up Danger, pivotal for the movie itself in terms of a plot point. And Sunflowers, I think, was the biggest one from that album. And this album, I feel like this album was fantastic and I loved it. And I have it on like repeat. The only difference I would say is I feel like more of an attachment to the first one in terms of its relation to the movie itself, of when these songs came on and how they kind of coincided with the plot of the story and Into the Spider-Verse. But Across the Spider-Verse had bangers. God, like my top three, like it's like not even like it's the top three main ones, but like Annihilate, Am I Dreaming, and what I think was underrated, like I barely hear anybody, if not have heard anybody, talk about Silk and Cologne on the album. Man, that's like when they were at Miles's dad, Jefferson Davis, his promotion like party that he had, becoming captain, and that party that they had on the rooftop. That song, that banged, literally like on repeat. Like I'll go back, repeat for like 30 minutes, just that one song. I wish they made more like that. But soundtrack, phenomenal. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but like, even if you're not going to watch the movie, or if you have or haven't, soundtracks are great. Like, go add them to your playlists. But yeah, so now to get into kind of more of the nitty gritty of the movie, I want to talk about the main characters, and kind of how their roles have progressed, if they were involved in Into the Spider-Verse, or if they're new introductory characters in Across the Spider-Verse. I think you got to just start off with Miles. With Miles, it's like watching him grow up without having to like see the in-between part. Like the time, like the relative time jump, I think is like about a year, if I remember correctly, that he was in middle school in the first one and he's a sophomore in this one. So it's at least a year and a half since he's been Spider-Man, and kind of how they start off in Across the Spider-Verse. Like he's gotten into the groove of it. And my thing was like what like character development they were going to give him in this movie as opposed to the previous one, because the previous one was focused on him not thinking that he could take up that mantle of Spider-Man, him feeling that he didn't belong in that role, or he wasn't capable. And for him at the end with the leap of faith is kind of like the real culmination of that movie. And in this movie, in Across the Spider-Verse, it seems more that he's comfortable in being Spider-Man, but the second now that he's comfortable, he's then thrust into a world of that shows how his perception of how he can do this job is different in the grand scheme of not only the universe, but the multiverse, the many other millions of Spider-Men that exist, and how they feel in their roles as this character, and how he is the outlier in that sense. But what I think this movie needs that the first movie did have, and I this comes with a caveat, because this movie is essentially a part one of two. Like, it's not like a trilogy in the sense of like, let's say the Dark Knight trilogy, where each movie feels more standalone. At the end of each Dark Knight movie, you feel like, okay, this is the end of the movie. This is it. And maybe they'll have like an end, maybe not end credit scene, but a scene at the end that may lead to the next one, but it's not necessarily a cliffhanger. But with Across the Spider-Verse, it was a more deliberate, like we're at the halfway point cliffhanger of the actions within the first, this movie, Across the Spider-Verse, are directly involved in the second. There will be like most likely no time jumps. It will get right into it. And that's why leaving Across the Spider-Verse felt less like it felt amazing. Like what we watched, absolutely phenomenal. But like you're yearning for more. And I think that in this case, it should actually not be a knock against the movie because that's the intention. And I think a lot of times judging movies, people feel like they judge movies the same across the board. But a lot of times what I like to think is, did the director, did the producers achieve what they aim to achieve with this movie, right? Because you can't judge a horror movie the same as a comedy, or a comedy the same as an action movie if they're not like all interrelated. Like they have different purposes. And for example, like when I watch like Godzilla versus King Kong, or I watch a Transformers movie, am I that interested in the plot? Probably not. I'm more interested in giant monsters fighting giant robots, or giant monsters fighting giant monsters, or giant robots fighting giant robots. Like I'm looking for the action. That's what I'm there for. Like, and they deliver, right? And this movie isn't supposed to be a copy paste of Into the Spider-Verse, in my opinion. Like it's increasing the scale. And after watching Into the Spider-Verse again, recently, a couple times, I'm now noticing the tonal differences between the two in terms of like the world and the scheme of what's going on. Like it's like almost reversed. In Into the Spider-Verse, Miles' task is to save the multiverses from collapsing and everybody dying, right? That was his intrinsic task, that not, well, external task, but like his internal goal was to achieve that. But in Across the Spider-Verse, it's almost like the role is flipped, where he is now aiming to save just one person out of the multiverse, with the threat of the multiverse, quote unquote, collapsing still. But it's more of like he's hyper focusing now his goal, which is now to save his father, who's going to be captain, from dying. And in the movie, if you've already seen it, and you shouldn't be watching this far if you haven't seen it, but it is stated by Spider-Man 2099, Miguel O'Hara, that if he does do this, it will break like how continuity is supposed to go. And as a quick side kind of tangent, which this whole podcast is just tangents, they label it, just checking my recording, they label it as a canon event. And for those who are not like as initiated with comics, or like, I think this term is used in anime as well and other forms of media, but canon is a word that in comic media and written media, that is used to describe like things that are supposed to happen within a specific universe, or things that directly are a part of a universe and are not like outside of the scope of what the original creators intended, right? So like there's some movies out there, or there's some like, for example, the Joker with Joaquin Phoenix is not necessarily canon. It's not like a true origin story of the Joker or representation of that. It's kind of like a multiverse, otherworld kind of adaptation, or what could be, right? So that wouldn't be described as quote unquote canon, because it's not the direct kind of story for a character that's kind of been established. And stuff like canon is malleable. It's not necessarily always like set in stone, but there's certain things that are kind of more apparent, like Uncle Ben dying, or in this case, it'll be Uncle Ben, or like even in like Batman's case, like his parents dying or whatever. These would be as canon. So it's cool that in the movie they referred to moments in time that are crucial to their construct of time and the movement forward of their timeline as canon events. And that's one of the things that this movie, I feel like really hit the nail in terms of like providing a specific term to something that both comic book fans like appreciate, but it also has been adopted by non-comic book fans. And like you see all the memes of like, let's say like you find out your girl cheating on you, like that's your canon event. And I just find it so like awesome to see like comic book and other related like lore like permeate across like the zeitgeist, and if I use that word correctly, and pop culture in general. Like it just makes me feel like super sick. Not like sick in a bad way, sick in a good way. But yeah. So where was I talking about? Oh yeah. So Miles's goals in this are like to kind of dial in his focus of who he's saving. And although like the story got grander, Miles's focus got narrower, which I think is a very cool like juxtaposition of the plot. And it kind of like leads into kind of how the supporting characters like interact with him. Because in the first movie, Miles was kind of like, even they didn't even want like the Spider people, like his gang in that movie were like Spider-Man Noir, Spider-Ham, Peter B. Parker, Gwen, and I think Penny Parker was it, that they didn't think that he was capable enough, and they had to like, they wanted to bench him. They literally benched him, sidelined him, because they thought that he wasn't prepared. And now in this movie, like no one can mess with Miles. Like Eve took the whole Spider Society to come chase him, and they still couldn't like pin him down, and he outsmarted them all. So it's kind of like it's like a weird back and forth of like the grandness of the story, but the focus that Miles has and his goals, and how like they kind of flip flop into the Spider-Verse and across the Spider-Verse. I don't know if that's something that anybody else like noticed or if it's even correct, but I always found that interesting. But in terms of like the other characters, I feel like the supporting cast that Miles had in Across the Spider-Verse were in general more, I don't know, I just love them more. In my personal opinion, I love them more. Like I didn't have necessarily a connection to like Spider-Ham or like Penny Parker or even Spider-Man Noir from the first one. But in Across the Spider-Verse, you got, I'm not gonna even, like, I'm gonna mess up his name. And it's gonna be bad because as a brown person, but Spider-Man India, who was in this, Spider-Punk, Hobie Brown, the GOAT. I'll get into that in a second. The GOAT. Miguel O'Hara, who is not necessarily on his squad, but just as a supporting cast character. Spider-Man 2099. And even like the roles of Miles's mom and dad, Rio and Jefferson, like it seems they're even more an integral part of the story. So although the story got grander, the characters got, I think, more involved in a more succinct, like directly to Miles related way, which I thought was really interesting. And I could talk more about Miles in a bit, but genuinely, it was so cool to see him like be the like almost like the perfect Spider-Man that he was aiming to be in the first one at the beginning of this one. So we didn't have to go through like that arc of him trying to find that way. Like he's got it. It's good to go. Let's bring in other threats to that, so we don't rehash that same kind of plot point, and see what that means in terms of him moving forward with the things that are thrown at him. But I think the next kind of big like leap in characterization that we see from the first one to the second one is with Gwen. And I think like Gwen is like probably just as much of a pivotal character in this one as Miles is, because like they even start the movie off with Gwen, and she's kind of like the drive. Like Gwen is more of like the driver of the plot in a sense. Like, and Miles is more reacting, which is I always find confusing because sometimes reacting is driving the plot, but like there was like a lot more focus on Gwen in this one and her relationship with her father, who is a kind of newly introduced character, although he kind of exists for like a split second in the first one, just her saving him. But in this one, the father is a more fleshed out character and plays a pivotal role in how Gwen operates, as well as how kind of her trust lies and the secrets that she keeps from both her father, but as well as Miles. And a characterization of Gwen, I think, that's really like picking up is, and I don't want to forget to mention like how Gwen's character like impacts pop culture, because there was a lot of I don't know if this is just like a Twitter thing or if this was discussions had in other like forums or in real life, but the kind of association that, or the what is it called? The theory that Gwen might be trans, like a trans woman. Although I don't believe that is the case, since I don't think that there was like any specific like call to that, other than what people are saying is like the colors of her world are what the trans flag's colors are. I think like it's the white, like pink and baby blue. And there are that kind of thematic crossovers in kind of the story of like her hiding her true identity as Spider-Woman to her father, and how trans people may feel like they're hiding their true identity from their parents. So I do believe that that kind of people associating themselves with that kind of story who are of that kind of community makes like total sense. But what I would say is also that even if it's not something that is specifically called out to as this being a character trait of the person or this being a plot point to the character, I do feel like there is merit to when people feel like they are like they find attributes in themselves in a character, even if that character doesn't necessarily reflect canonically or in canon to that kind of statement. Like, and I'll give the example of this. It's funny, but like the other day I was just like, so I'm obsessed with Mulan. Like that's my favorite Disney movie. And literally like I was just listening to like the soundtrack, or my favorite song on the album was like, I'll Make a Man Out of You. And I guess interesting choice now that we're talking about if Gwen is trans, but just in terms of like how that song, like when I listen to that song, I am not a woman who is in a man's world trying to like pass off being a man, but the kind of overcoming of that struggle that Mulan faces in that in not only that movie but that song specifically, and what she's able to achieve by the end of just the song of like perseverance and like kind of breaking past, even if it's an internal barrier that other people may not know, because no one else knows that she is not a man, but her internal struggle to prove herself to herself, but amongst the community that she's in, or the environment that she's in, I really related to. So like literally brought a tear to my eye, just randomly sitting on that like bed right there, just listening to that song again. That song slaps so hard that no one understands. Peak Disney right there, Mulan. But what all that to say is that I don't think that we should shut down people attributing their personal lives to these stories, because that's ultimately the whole point. That's the whole reason why it's like superheroes like Spider-Man exist, and even Stan Lee has stated that that's why Spider-Man, his characters doesn't have like show his like bottom part of his face like Batman, or show anything else. It's like anybody could wear the mask in a sense, right? Or not in a sense. They even say that deliberately in the first one, where like Spider-Man in this term is just a manifestation of your goals, and anyone can achieve kind of that. It doesn't matter like who you are like underneath. So that's kind of like what I related to with the Mulan thing. And I think that's what like a lot of people relate to with how Gwen interacted with her dad, even if it's not necessarily trans specific, although like I believe that it was already like Gwen's colors that she has that like become like watercolored into her world. But for people who kind of feel like whether they're part of any community in association with a character, I feel like that's valid because the point of these kind of movies is to kind of be a reflection of us and in a more fantastical way. So that's what I think about that. And I think a lot of discussions kind of move away from the story and more like arguments between like what is true and what isn't true, and kind of not really obsessing over the true point of the movies themselves. And it just becomes kind of like defeats the purpose of what these movies are trying to convey. But yeah, but who I don't feel like, who I was very iffy about, especially the first time watching, was like Gwen's dad, who was like literally like she was afraid to tell him that she was Spider-Woman because it had looked like she was over her Peter's body when he died. And I'm like, look, you'll have a brain. Like, why would, like, you saw that Peter was this giant lizard acting crazy, right? But then, like, so this is my problem, is that I wanted to get mad at like Captain Stacy, Gwen's dad, of like, why are you thinking that Spider-Woman would do that? And then I watched the first Into the Spider-Verse, and it was a kind of a similar theme where Miles' dad thought Spider-Man or himself killed Aaron Davis, which is the Prowler, which is Miles' uncle. But ultimately, I feel like, so when so this movie has so much, these movies have so much going on. I feel like I'm just like on a bunch of random tangents, and we'll see if anybody's even still interested at this point, but I'm going to keep pushing forward. But in the first movie, as soon as Jefferson Davis, basically Miles' dad, I should say, sees Spider-Man being heroic and fighting Kingpin, he kind of removes his idea that Spider-Man will be the one who would have killed Prowler. So then when it comes to like Captain Stacy, after he thinks that Spider-Woman killed Peter, even when she's still saving everybody, he's still like trying to be out to get her. I'm like, yo, have a brain, bro. Like, this person's freaking saving everybody. Why are you still thinking that this person would murder this just like random kid who was a giant lizard at one point? Like, think about it for a second. Like, you're making this your whole prerogative. And then even when Gwen revealed herself to be Spider-Woman to freaking her dad, he's like, put him up. Like, put him up. I ain't playing. And I'm like, it's your daughter. Like, at least have the conversation, you freaking doofus. I feel like Miles' dad wouldn't be like that. I feel like Miles' dad would be like, oh shit. Like, what's going on here? All right, let me figure it out. Let me help you out. Like, let's get to the bottom of what's going on here. He was like, yo, freaking, you're getting sent to downtown, bucko. I'm like, you're so dumb. And then quits his job later because he's like, damn, maybe I am dumb. And I started this podcast not thinking of not being fully sure if a Captain Stacy was dumb or not. Because ultimately he redeems himself with Gwen. But I think he was dumb for like 20 minutes. A good solid 20 minutes. Like, yo, fucking relax. Anyways, that's what I think about those characters. Probably more that I could talk about. I love Miles' dad. Super sick, super funny. And I can't wait to see the role that he plays in Beyond the Spider-Verse. Jefferson Davis. because like the movie's gonna be basically hinging upon whether he like survives or doesn't. And he better survive, I swear to God. You can't just make this whole thing about Miles like breaking canon and saving just the one person to like undo all of that in Beyond the Spider-Verse and be like, you know what? Everybody else was right and Miles was wrong. So I hope no one dies in the second one. Or in the third one, I should say. But yeah. But now to get to kind of like why that is the case, or how these characters believe that everything's gonna shut down, or everything's gonna break apart if you break a singular moment in time, like the continuity, and like the introduction of Spider-Man 2099, whose main prerogative is to like stop all this from like breaking timelines, which is very similar to the TVA in the Loki series. Like he basically put together his own TVA unit, and it would have been cooler, but like I feel like the more times we now see multiverse stories, like it's kind of getting a little too much, or maybe a lot too much. Like you're seeing multiverse in the CW DC shows like The Flash and Arrow. Like there's multiverse in that. There's Multiverse of Madness. There's Spider-Man No Way Home, which was multiverse. There was freaking the What If shows, which was multiverse. There's the Loki, which is multiverse. There's freaking a little bit of Ant-Man, which is multiverse. And I know that they're in the multiverse saga for Marvel, but they're also doing it in like DC as well with like the Flash movie and everything like that. And it's kind of like, it's losing its kind of appeal of like it's like an excuse to just have random different characters appear, as opposed to like how that appears in a story. And it was fun, like 100% it was fun at first, but like now it's a little bit more like, all right, let's dial it back a little bit. Especially like how the MCU started, where it was like finite specific characters like Iron Man and Captain America and whatever. It was less the idea of like anybody can be here at any time, or like there's a different version of you at any given time. So that was one of my many tangents. But yeah, Spider-Man 29, sick character. Like, and to be quite honest, the only things I've known about the character was kind of what I've watched from like the Ultimate Spider-Man show and kind of like research of the character back then. Because I was always like more of a DC fan, so I was watching more of like Batman Beyond, which is like the Batman version of Spider-Man 2099. So it just kind of felt like it was like the same thing again. And I think they did have like an issue like in the early 2000s where they were going to make a Spider-Man 2099 show and then kind of like scrapped it because Batman Beyond was like so similar. But what they were able to do with this character, and like he was kind of like, he's like the secondary antagonist of this movie. And I think he played like a very cool role, because it's not necessarily that he's the bad guy, but he's preventing Miles from doing a specific thing, but it's overall from what he says, the greater good, which there's been a lot of speculation that Spider-Man 2099, his statements about the universe is collapsing because you breaking specific events may not be entirely factual, which could be an interesting thing to kind of dive deeper into Beyond the Spider-Verse. But I believe in Beyond the Spider-Verse, he's going to overall change from the role of being antagonist to like helping Miles side by side. I find it hard to believe that he will continue to be an antagonist for the entirety of the third movie. But man, this dude was freaking brolic. He was like in the first, like in the post-credit scenes of the first one, he like looked like a Spider-Man, but in this one he was just like literally a Dorito, like built like a Dorito straight up. And the cool things about like his character is that he has like different sets of like spider-like powers than like the other Spider-Man. Like he has fangs that can inject like venom that paralyzes people. They didn't really show that much. They kind of like a scene where he was about to bite, I think, the Vulture, in the beginning and didn't end up doing it, but he apparently cannot climb on walls like other Spider-Man in the sense of sticking to them. Like he has claws that he like kind of pierces into things, and that's how he climbs. And they like show all these small little details like in the movie of him like climbing up stuff. So I think like this movie is like so chock full of tiny little details. Like that might be a whole separate kind of video of like the little Easter eggs that they have, or the little kind of minute details that transfer from Into the Spider-Verse into Across the Spider-Verse, like the spider itself, the character getting hit with the bagel ultimately end up being Spot in the second installment, and then you can watch the first one with a different kind of like viewpoint after watching the second one. So I think that's just really cool, and it'll make like this this trilogy ultimately like timeless, because with each watch you can notice something different, which I think is a testament to like great movies. But before I get into the villains, we need to get into the Spider Goat. All right. Hobie Mother Flippin' Brown. All right, this guy, man. I remember when he like first pulled up on the scene in the movie, I was a little bit tentative because Gwen was being mad weird, like was acting like he was like a side piece to Miles, even though she wasn't really dating Miles, but like she was like maybe had a thing with Hobie, which in my opinion I don't believe so. I believe like Hobie is more of like an older brother type character who's like harboring Gwen as she like escaped her universe, running away from her dad. And given the fact that like Hobie is like very anti-establishment, of course like anti-police, he would be willing to help like a person running away from a situation like that and letting Gwen stay. But ultimately Hobie, man, it doesn't get sicker than him. Like he, in every scene he's in, he steals the show. In both actual like visuals, like his character is always like visually changing, like at every second. But also in terms of impact of the story, and very unique of a impact on the plot, as opposed to the other characters where they seem more linear in their goals. Whereas Hobie is a more like let happen as whatever happens, if that's even a statement. And the kind of the anti-establishment, the anti-structural part of his whole ideology kind of really plays into like giving Miles the confidence that he doesn't have to fit necessarily the mold of what he's kind of quote unquote supposed to be. Because in the first movie, Miles' whole prerogative was fitting the mold. And in this movie, it's kind of him breaking the mold of like not following the path that is supposedly like laid out for him. And kind of breaking the confines of fate and timeline and what are supposed to happen. And it's also, from what I can tell, I think there's an interview on it from the creators where it's also like, I don't know if the right term is, but allegory to kind of, or an analogy, I should say, to how people perceive Miles in the real world, like how, in our world, like how they don't believe he is like people who are very racist, right? And I think there are racist, and there's all people who are like diet racist about it. Like, oh, Spider-Man can't be black. You're just trying to make any character black, right? But it's not like it's Peter Parker just becoming black. It's Miles is his own character who has a mantle of Spider-Man. Like, there's like 4 different Flashes. There's like, well, there's a couple of Batman now. Dick Grayson was Batman at a certain point. Like, although it does get confusing that there's like two kind of quote unquote Spider-Man when you're referring to them together. Like Miles is just straight up Spider-Man. I don't know what to tell you. Like we can, like maybe you can have like a qualifier when you're talking about both of them together, like Peter and Miles, where you like Miles is Ultimate Spider-Man from like a whole long story about the Ultimate comic book universe, and Peter is like the Amazing Spider-Man. And they didn't seem that issue when like Dr. Octopus in one comic book run became Spider-Man himself and was labeled as the superior Spider-Man. Like he is just Spider-Man. That's just his name, right? Would it have been kind of interesting to see if like Miles had his own like Spider-Man code name, like how there's like Scarlet Spider or there's like Ghost Spider for Spider-Gwen, or yeah. But like he's just straight up Spider-Man, so like in his stories, and especially like in what they're trying to convey with the like multiverse of Spider-Men, like how can you not just be labeled as like you're Spider-Man if everyone else in that universe is freaking Spider-Man as well? Like you're supposed to be the only one who's just supposed to like break the mold because people are mad. Like I don't think so. I do think that they need to find a way to kind of label it when talking about them, because it becomes weird when like I just saw recently like they had like a new comic book story where there's like Moon Knight and both Miles and Peter, and they have like they label Moon Knight as Moon Knight, they label Peter Parker as Spider-Man, and they just label Miles as Miles. So it's like you have Miles Morales. Well, you have Moon Knight, Spider-Man, and Miles Morales. Like, well, that's not his superhero name. That's just his name. So there is something that needs to be fixed, and that people have stated like the qualifier of like, or like the adjective of like Ultimate Spider-Man. Now I'm getting a little too in the weeds for non-comic book people, but you probably have, if not, will come across people with their disdain for Miles even being Spider-Man in the first place, and that's kind of what a lot of this movie kind of alludes to, that kind of talk, especially when like Miguel is like, oh, you don't belong here and you were never supposed to be Spider-Man. It's kind of like him talking, or like him being a projection of a lot of what like toxic audience or comic book people feel. And there's a lot of weirdos out there, especially in the comic book culture. Like it's not even as much of an issue, I don't think, outside of comic book people. It's more like comic book purists themselves with like these newer characters. And I'm always a big advocate of like original characters, right? As opposed to kind of like these companies being lazy and not wanting to put effort behind propping up and kind of really promoting the many like minority characters that already exist, right? They just want to find an IP that already works and feel like if they can get away with just using that as a minority character, which I don't feel like Miles is, because Miles is like has his own identity, has his own kind of way of going about being Spider-Man, and even has his own unique powers as well on top of that. Like I feel like this also opens the gates for, I hope, like DC to see the success of the Spider-Verse movies and really pushes like characters like Static Shock, which is bro, I'm like I'm a Static Shock fan to the grave, all right? And when he starts popping, I'm going to refer to this video. Like I even have like, I'll try to find it, like videos of me as a kid writing like how Static Shock was one of my favorite like TV shows and heroes. And I wish that other companies can see the success of these movies and really push like those original characters. And it would be nice to see, because I would like to see like other characters, like Middle Eastern characters, get their own kind of like shine and like history involved. And with the character like Spider-Man, where there's already an established like multiverse aspect of it, I think that was a real great opportunity, especially like with Spider-Man India. They were able to show that, like all the culture involved in that, and even with the sub references with like the chai tea and the naan bread and all that, like double like statements that people in like the brown communities find like funny that other people say, but this gives opportunity for those things to happen. If you just keep it so strict-lined in terms of like only one person, like you can only tell Peter Parker stories, you remove like all the capabilities that are there for story, right? Where people can still come up with original characters that are adjacent or congruent to a story like Peter Parker's, but you're getting way more experience and way more stories being told as opposed to rehashing the same things over and over again. Which is, I think, kind of, now that I think about it, like a point of this whole Across the Spider-Verse movie is like, in terms of canon and breaking it, is like, these stories have been told again and again and again with like, okay, Uncle Ben dying, or like Captain Stacy dying, or like the captain of the police department, like that. It doesn't have to always be like this. So that's what I'm hoping, that even in Beyond the Spider-Verse, it really doubles down on that. And I'm assuming, hopefully, if all goes correctly, that that's what Miles will be able to achieve, and maybe put that seed in people's mind that like there are more stories to be told, and to not be stuck in the confines of what people think you should be, kind of like how Miguel O'Hara is operating in this movie. But yeah, but Hobie, I mean, I started off talking about Hobie. Hobie is super sick, and he was like one of my favorite characters in this movie, and even across both Spider-Verse movies, like, because he just seems like very assured and confident in himself and what his goals are. That is to kind of make sure that the people he directly cares about are good, right? And everything else he has hope that will fall into place. So even like him being part of this like whole Spider Society is kind of like a means to protect Gwen, and then to ultimately protect like Spider-Man India, or the Spider-Man in India in that universe. Like he has a cool brotherly relationship with Hobie as well. And I think also Gwen has a sibling kind of, it's a little iffy there, but like they kind of, I think, leave that up in the air to like really like sink in Miles' jealousy, even though I don't think that's the case between them. But I thought that was really interesting, and how watching it again, or like watching Across the Spider-Verse again, is worth it, because you can see the small details of like how Hobie is like walking around like grabbing stuff, slowly like collecting things to build a watch. Like he has the game plan ahead, right? And kind of another way of like showing that like all the spider people have like high intelligence, but their independence is like a defining character that changes between them. Like there's a whole society of people who are just like kind of like, in a sense, blindly following Miguel, which is a criticism that people have for the movie that I somewhat agree with. That like if you had a bunch of like Peter Parkers or a bunch of Spider-Men, they wouldn't necessarily believe that a certain life has to be sacrificed for like the greater good, because that's almost like you're treading like villain territory. But with the like explanation that Miguel gives, it could be convincing. And I honestly believe that not even a lot of the spider people even know that's the case, right? It's only the case now that people are finding out about this because of what's going on with Miles. And he has like a very small like task force to kind of quell those like smaller like for a second I was tweaking at that the camera wasn't recording, but to button up those like universal anomalies to prevent like those universes from collapsing or whatever. But the theory that this could all be a sham, or like what Miguel is saying, or somewhat of a sham, like I'm interested to see what's going to happen in the next one. But I think the villains in this one, as compared to the first one, are like superior. Like obviously Prowler was super sick in the first one, but Kingpin, I feel like wasn't like truly fleshed out as a villain in the first one. And Into the Spider-Verse, I feel like it was just more like generic villain, and it was more of, the story was like more about Miles really coming into fully terms of being Spider-Man, and that was like his main obstacle. And Kingpin was like almost like a placeholder, like kind of a Spider-Man villain, in my opinion, more of a Daredevil villain that they just kind of keep dropping into Spider-Man stuff. But But yeah, in the first one you have Prowler, Liv, the female Dr. Octopus, and Kingpin. Prowler super sick. I feel like Liv was like very I loved her character. I wish like there was more of her, and I wish she was more of a driving force of the whole operation, as opposed to like Kingpin hiring her for that purpose of finding his wife, which I feel like they didn't really dive into as much as I thought that they would, looking back on it. So, but yeah, but in the second one, it feels like the total amount of villains were less, but it was more of a, like, Miguel is an antagonist. I wouldn't say villain. And the Spot, like the progression of Spot's character, really like, it's almost like the juxtaposition of how he was in the beginning of the movie as opposed to the end really establishes like how scary of a character he is. Cause it's not like he came out like out the cut, like, I'm going to kill you, Spider-Man. Like he was literally almost like it was literally like him fighting Spider-Man was like a pastime, or like they were just like having fun with it almost, as opposed to like when his real psychosis starts settling in and him trying to prove himself as like a worthy adversary to Spider-Man, and how that kind of takes over his mind. And then like you see that manifest when he's getting all that power, changing from white with black spots to like black with white spots, and like it's a more like squiggly and scraggly and less clean cut and defined. Then you're like, oh shit, like it's popping off now. Like that fear really comes into play, as opposed to like the first one where like Kingpin was scary because how big he was and how much of a freaking brute he was. But yeah, like I would say that the second one had a less breadth of villains. Like they had like Tombstone and Prowler, Doc Ock, and Kingpin in the first one. This one was kind of more relegated to Miguel being an antagonist and the Spot being the true villain. But man, like they really hit a home run with that character. And I'm like, it was like his theme song and everything like was like terrifying. And they're perfect with these like theme song, like with like even in the first one, like they had like the Prowler's theme, Miguel's theme, and now the Spot's theme, like sounds that when they come in, like they're becoming iconic in and of themselves and becoming like even like TikTok sounds and like permeating society, which I think is super sick, kind of going back to what I was talking about earlier. But the villains in this were super sick, and kind of like we don't even know the full extent of those characters because like we said before, this is like a part one, and it was kind of more of like Miles figuring stuff out and figuring out the problems that are happening. And in the second one, we're really going to see like those actual like villains and antagonists, like what effect they're going to, like what impact they're going to directly have on Miles, and how Miles is going to have to directly fight that, as opposed to just learning about the issues right now. But yeah, so, and then, I almost forgot the twist scene at the end with Miles ending up in the wrong universe. First of all, seeing that the first time and like your eyes, literally my eyes opened wide, and I'm like, oh shit, like we have an issue on our hands. And then him finding his uncle Aaron, who was the Prowler in Into the Spider-Verse, who died in Into the Spider-Verse, just show up randomly, and how like everyone in the theater, like who had any sense of the first one, was like really like open mouth, like what the and then on top of that, like they just dropped, like they were just literally at the very end, they were just dropping bombs on us. It was like, first, Aaron Davis first, Miles is in the wrong universe. There's no Spider-Man in this universe. Second, Uncle Aaron coming through and him being still alive in this universe, and then Miles' dad being dead in this universe, and then on top of that, the freaking cherry on top of this malarkey of a situation is Miles's version of himself in this universe is the Prowler, right? And from what we can tell, looks like they kind of positioned it as him being the villain, but I don't believe that for much of the second one or for the entirety of the second one that the Prowler Miles will remain as such. I feel like he's more of like a I think I've seen this said before on an interview, like a more rough around the edges Miles, one who had to grow up in a society where, or in a neighborhood or a society that is less kind of, it was a more difficult upbringing, and you could kind of see him being like a more like tougher, like hardened version of Miles, especially with not having direct powers because he didn't get bit by the spider. But I don't see him being the villain for the entirety of the second one. I feel like they will find a way to work together to fight against whatever the hell Spot's got going on. But who knows what's going to happen in the second one. But I think that really made you leave the theater like, what the like, it's like thinking that there was much more to be had at that moment, which is kind of like a lot of people's like negative towards the movie. I don't necessarily see it as a negative, considering that the other one is close on the horizon. But as I mentioned before in the beginning of this podcast, who knows if that changes? It most likely will not be as soon as we think, but I think it's well worth it. What I am concerned is that this installment of it, as amazing as it was, if it gets outshined by the third one, it will feel more of like a filler movie in between the trilogy as opposed to like its own quote unquote standalone, which I do believe it serves well as a standalone movie, but the cliffhanger is just so hard and like solidified that like it doesn't feel quote unquote complete until we get to that next one. And then maybe that next one will really put this one into more of a like a better context. But it's almost going to be like two movies or like one long movie combined. That's how I'm going to think of it. Like it's an amazing first half to a really long movie. So I don't think that it necessarily gets docked points for that, but it feels less like if you think of like a traditional trilogy of like movies, it kind of breaks that mold. But listen, if this movie is anything, it's about breaking the mold and doing things different. And as Miles says, doing things his own way and their own way. So, I guess to cap it off, I think, like general overview of the movie, phenomenal, absolutely amazing. For people who are not even comic book fans, like especially like even if you don't even watch the first one, you can get a good grasp of this one, I think. The promotion, I believe, was amazing. Speaking of like these popcorn buckets that I got from AMC, which I will not ever be putting popcorn in because I think that's freaking gross. Like they're not even like built properly to put popcorn. Like I'm supposed to put popcorn like this into the back of the head and like eat it somehow. I don't know. But I use this as like, I put a little light in here with a little bit like cloth to make like a cool glowy Spider-Man. Put like a TikTok here of me making that. And then the Gwen one I got, since I'm like, I might as well, since I'm here. I'll put them over in my like Funko shelf over there. But generally like they give you a free poster. Like I love when movies go above and beyond in terms of promotion, because I think it establishes itself with like the culture and people being able to engage outside of just like sitting down in the theater. There was a lot of that with the Batman with Robert Pattinson. Like you could literally get like a Batman Little Caesars pizza or a Batman poster from like Little Caesars, or you could get like little like Batman knickknacks from other stores or other promotional materials. I just love when studios go above and beyond for that. So I think that's super sick. Like pros, like almost everything about this movie, but the spectacle of it is like you have to watch in theaters. And then even at home it's still fun, but like in theaters, like just the sheer like multiple animation styles all mixed in together. Like even Hobie himself was like changing visual styles like every few seconds, which took a lot of time to animate, which back to the original, like I hope they give them enough time to really flesh all of this out in the second one in terms of animation without burning out the people working on it, because we want more of these people to feel comfortable in, like in terms of animators, comfortable in being parts of these projects and putting their heart and soul into it without the fear of it coming at the cost of like their own like livelihood. That way we can get more of these kind of movies in the future, right? With a lot of love and passion behind them, because these movies like aren't just like cash grabs in my opinion. Like the Spider-Verse movies, like they have a lot of heart and soul in them, which I appreciate a lot as a comic book fan, and as a person who's watching who's not a comic book fan can really also like just see it in terms of story, that it's less like, oh, here's a random person that you don't know about. Like even if you don't know any of the cameo characters, they put a lot of love into those characters and their characterizations and how they operate, that it could be your first time ever hearing of a character like Spider-Punk, and you can like be enamored and fall in love with the character. So I think that's super sick. And like the different like universes, design styles, like Gwen's universe, very unique, like the watercolor pastels, like how that manifests in the story itself visually is like perfect, like literally amazing. And so I can't wait for the next installment. But yeah, I don't know if I have a couple, like I talked about the quote unquote negatives, like they're very not they're not objective truths, these negatives, which is rarely the case in movies in general. It's more of like the fact that it's leading into another movie could give it some kind of like pushback, but that just means that people are itching for more, which I think is a positive. So yeah, man, I talked so much. I think there's like so much I missed. I don't know if this might need a part 2 with diving into greater detail. Maybe not. Maybe I'll have a guest on and we can talk about what we think about the movie and small things that have come about, like in the first one leading into the second one, and kind of the second one calling back to the first one. But yeah, I think I wanted to end it with if you haven't watched the movie and you just listen to me spoil this for like how long? Let me see. Like an hour and 20 minutes or whatever it is so far. Please go watch the movie. Watch it again if you have to. I'm really mad that they don't have the first one on streaming. Sony, you bastards. Like, you're literally cutting out a whole segment of people who could have watched the first one going into the second one, right? Like, and really appreciated what you guys spent so much time creating even more, as opposed to putting it behind a paywall. Like I paid for it like in full just so I could watch it continuously and show it to friends and family at home. And I love watching like movies like multiple times, especially with new people. Like I'm more watching them than I am watching the movie. But Sony, get it together. Like don't make a whole streaming service. Please don't do that. But get Spider-Verse back on Netflix or something like it used to be, so that people can enjoy both. But yeah, I think Across Spider-Verse is coming out in August. So I don't know if they'll have that on streaming, but hope they do so people can watch both. But all in all, fantastic movie. This was the closest thing I could find to a Miles Morales shirt. I will be on the hunt for a sick one that doesn't look like it belongs on a toddler. But even though this is not Miles' logo, but it's red and black, so it'll suffice for now. But Yeah, I think first video podcast successful, more to come, as I say, and then I don't actually do, but I will. But thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace. Also, I wanted to say this. I forgot about talking about this earlier, but the dialogue in this movie and Across the Spider-Verse. Ooh. Hold on. Let me just step back in the seat real quick. Listen, when they were talking to Hobie and they were like straight up like, "Oh, you're not," they're like, he said something to Miles. I forgot what he said, but the other Jessica Drew Spider Woman was like, "You're not helping," and literally without an ounce of hesitation, this guy was like, "Good." Ooh, bro, I forgot to talk. I didn't even talk about Hobie as much on this. I feel like I did a little bit, but like, this man was out of control in the best way possible. And they said that they're gonna do more Hobie stuff and Spider-Punk stuff in the next installment. So this guy was such a G, straight up, like unfuckwithable. All right, man. I'm gonna stop recording and I'm gonna think about more things to say about him. How he's cool. Oh, I didn't even talk about freaking Peter B. Parker this whole time. You know what? Let me just get comfortable. I'm already back in here. Let's get comfortable, guys. We're back. This is the post-credit scene. Peter B. With Mayday. Cute little baby. Cute little baby. Oh my God, Mayday was so cute. Even though he shouldn't have been bringing Mayday to these fighting places, and Jessica Drew shouldn't have been bringing her pregnant ass zooping around on her motorcycle with the baby just like in an earthquake in her body. And Mayday shouldn't have been there, but she was cute, so I guess you could visibly see, so it was cuter, I guess. But how Hobie was with Mayday, like all his little scenes with her, perfect. Like it just showed like how much like care and love he had, on top of the contempt and confidence that he had against everybody else who was like giving like negative energy, like Miguel or anybody else. But I want to see like how Spider-Punk then interacts with Spot later on and stuff like that. But Hobie the GOAT, I think that's all I wanted to say. I liked how Peter B became more fatherly, especially becoming a father, but with Miles as well. And I don't believe that he had malintent with Miles, like especially when everyone found when they were like talking and having that conversation, and Miles had a distrust for Peter B then. Like I think like Miles' distrust to Gwen is more justified than his distrust to Peter B. Okay, we're recording, thank God. Because Peter B has a more, I think, direct reasoning to Miles specifically tie that, but I could just be making stuff up at this point. But I want to see Peter B and be like full Spider-Man in the next one, not wear just the pink robe, and let Mayday swing around to do her thing. But great additions to these characters. I think that the supporting cast of Across the Spider-Verse, like although I loved Into the Spider-Verse, like the extra characters, I think the supporting cast of Across the Spider-Verse really blew the other ones out of the water, like super iconic and awesome. I'm going to sit here and think about things that I may have forgotten to talk about, and I will do a time lapse. Never mind. I think I covered it. Peace again.